Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Bill Considine. I was the first dean of the School of Health, Physical Education, and Recreation. After I retired, I was followed by Charlie Redmond, who was the second dean. And then when he retired, Tracy Matthews. I don't think Tracy's here, but she became the third dean of the school. I really appreciate the fact that those two folks really worked hard to enhance the mission of the school and of the college. They recruited and supported excellent faculty for our students. I'm sorry to have to tell you that I learned the fact that Tracy will be leaving at the end of this semester to accept the deanship at Jacksonville State College. Fortunately, one of our faculty, Dr. Sue Geyer, will be acting as interim dean during the second semester. I'm sure she'll continue to support the mission of the school and the college. With that, I would like to deviate a little bit and make a quick announcement, and that is that we're going to have a reception for grad students only in the alumni tent. Dr. Betty Mann had advocated for years that we need to have a reception for graduate students, those that did not get their undergraduate degrees at Springfield but came here for their graduate education. And so we tried to have one of those at Reunion last summer, and we're going to continue that. So if any of you would like to join us, it will be in the alumni tent at approximately 12:30. Okay? With that, I'll turn it over to Charlie.
Thanks, boss. Yes, thank you. I have to be very careful here. I have two former bosses here. Dean Considine and President Flynn. So I cut off some of my little jokes here.
They can't hurt you now. They can't
They can't do anything to me now, one.
No power.
Wait and see.
Be surprised. Again, welcome. I appreciate everybody coming. I'm very excited the opportunity to moderate this morning's discussion. A little history on this. Bonnie Cox and Tammy Cadets, Bonnie Advancement and Tammy from Alumni, a couple years ago now decided to do some programming for the special population of mature alums in front of And so they decided to do some academic, if you will, programming. And they thought, building on the mission of the college and the spirit, mind, and body, to focus on the topic of wellness, which is just a huge, huge topic. So they asked me if I'd like to get involved. Had taught health back in the 70s. And it was funny because I pulled some notes out. A keeper here, obviously. I have notes from 1970, a little scary. And looked up the definition of what we might call today wellness, and it was simply the absence of disease. That was it. I could show you textbooks and notes. Certainly the definition has grown substantially, and we now have this concept of wellness. So we built a panel presentation like this last year, focusing on the physical activity aspect of wellness. Very, very successful, very well attended, very energizing. And then that followed up that we did a webinar, I think one of the first webinars that were done on that same topic. So they said, let's keep this going. So this is, I guess, the second in the series, and hopefully maybe the third and fourth out there. And we're gonna focus on nutrition. What I'd like to do is kind of set the theme of the definition that we used for wellness as we built on talking about exercise last year and talking about nutrition this year. So we're going to define wellness for our discussion today as an active process. Key that we understand this is an active process. It's not passive. Wellness does not work unless we're actively involved in it, through which people become aware of and make choices. We have some interesting choices on our little food selections there today, and it's not a test. But make choices toward more healthy existence. It requires awareness, and hopefully programs like this create some awareness, and accurate scientific knowledge that supports taking responsibility. Your wellness is your responsibility for making intentional healthy choices. So we're trying to building off that definition that we used last year and do it again. The objective, the goal of this morning's program built around nutrition is to provide and share some current information. And there's lots and lots of information, as I'm sure we'll find some misinformation out there on nutrition as well, which I think is very important to talk about. And hopefully you'll leave here today with some practical, usable information on nutrition. We tried something a little bit different. So the format that we're doing this morning, instead of a formal PowerPoint presentation, is that we're going to make this more of a question and answer session. It's always fun to teach adult learners. That was a compliment. Adult learners, right? Because you have some contexts. You have some life's experience. The wonderful 18 and 17-year-olds that arrive here and continue 4 years, they're kind of a blank board. They don't have a lot of things to compare what they're learning to. You've got all sorts of contexts out there. I suspect, and don't prove me wrong, all sorts of questions, particularly this nutrition here. So we're going to try to make this interactive, and we're going to do it in a Q&A format. And what I've done, we've prepared some questions to get it going, but we're hoping it becomes a question and answer discussion between you and our panelists, who I'll introduce in a second. We've got some questions, but I think it's important you share your experiences and share your questions and leave with some practical information. So to accomplish that, they asked me to put together a little panel, and I've done that, and really a very, very special panel. On my far left is Dr. Donna Chapman. Donna is a professor, I got to get this right now because we have some new titles and new names on campus. She is a professor in the Department of Exercise Science and Athletic Training.
Perfect.
Okay, that's the new title. And she's involved with our Nutritional Sciences program. She got her PhD at the University of Connecticut in Nutritional Sciences, and we stole her from Yale School of Public Health to come to Springfield College several years ago. So I always viewed that as sort of a hiring coup. Our second panelist, known to probably many of you in the room, was a former faculty member in what was the Exercise Science and Sports Studies Department, but is now, I keep saying this, I'll learn exercise science and, if you're forgotten already. Athletic training, I should know that. They gave me the microphone. This could get scary here. Rich is also a PhD from the University of Connecticut in Nutritional Sciences. He's a former faculty member, left and is now in the private sector. And he's working in research and education in diabetes, which I think fits very, very clearly with some potential questions. So we thank them for coming here today. So I'm going to start with some questions, and instead of waiting for questions at the end, if you've got a question at any time, throw your hand up, break in, very informal, so we'd like to get a little discussion going. But I think the first question I'd like to ask is as much for personal information. When you look at nutrition, and you look at this particular, there's lots of terms, overlapping terms. So I'm going to ask the panelists to just kind of set the table here with define for us 3 basic terms, at least for the moderator's needs here. Could you please define the term diet, the term nutrition, and the term dietetics, which I suspect will come up in the discussions today. And they can fight over who's going to answer.
I think Donna's the right person to do that one, so go for it.
All right, so I think we could just generally say nutrition is really the science of how the human body, we're talking human nutrition here, so the science of how the human body utilizes food for all of the purposes that we need it. Okay, so that's a pretty general definition, but it kind of captures everything. As far as diet goes, I think we could really generally speak about that as your pattern of eating. So some people have a negative connotation to diet, but I think a healthy pattern of eating is your diet. So that's how I would define diet. And then the last one, dietetics. I would say that that's a sort of specialized area of nutrition, typically used when we're talking about the education of students who want to become registered dietitians. So they would go to a program that is considered a master's degree in dietetics, or sometimes you'll see nutrition and dietetics, but really the focus there is then on the education of students who want to become registered dietitians.
And I should also note that Dr. Chapman is a registered dietitian as well, gone through all of that. So thank you. Kind of gives us some terms that we're going to use here. First question, maybe a simple question, but I think a logical one to start off. Do we need to change what and how we eat as we age? Do we need to change what and how we eat as we age?
Want me to give it a shot at that?
Sure, I'll jump in, whatever.
Perfect. Well, first, I'm not going to derail, I promise, but hi everybody. I'm so excited to be back here. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of special people to me in this room. So, not the least of which Charlie. Charlie was my advisor when I was a freshman, and he has been a mentor for me forever. So I'm very grateful to be here. And thank you for inviting me. As we age, do things need to change? Yes. A lot of things do change. And one of the examples I've given is just simply with, if we talk about macronutrients, so carbohydrates, fat, protein, water is also a macronutrient. The needs for those in and of themselves change over the lifespan a little bit. So here's the example I give a lot of times. If somebody's an 18-year-old cross-country athlete, probably many people in this room are an 18-year-old athlete, if not all, you can eat a plate of pasta, a soda, probably have a couple of cupcakes, and your metabolic health would be pristine. Your weight would be great. Your athletic performance would be outstanding. If you ate the same meal, say in your late 30s, it probably wouldn't be handled quite as well, but you might be able to tolerate that. And then you move into your 60s, 70s, and it's definitely not going to be tolerated the same. So our needs change over time. And if we don't kind of look at that and address that, that's a challenge. So I'd say number one, absolutely they do change. But that's not enough. You're probably like, okay, well, what changes? The way that we tolerate carbohydrates is something that I specialize in. And I do believe very strongly most people tolerate a lot less carbohydrate as they get older. So it's important to take a look at that. You can see that in your blood panel values. So if you look at things like your fasting glucose, your hemoglobin A1C, your triglycerides, these are all ways we can tell how well we're tolerating the carbohydrate we eat. There's also a change in needs for micronutrients. So things like vitamin B12, things like iron. And as a registered dietitian, Donna is much more well equipped to talk about those than I am. But the needs for those also change. And I think that those are a little bit harder to figure out because you're not going to see them quite as easily. You're not usually going to get like a vitamin B12 plasma reading in your comprehensive metabolic panel that you get with your physician. But I would keep an eye on things like B12, iron, and certainly protein intake too.
Thank you. I'm just going to scan. Were you going to say something?
I'm
sorry, yeah.
Sure, I totally agree with everything that Rich has said so far, and I also wanted to just say, even our total caloric requirements, which is kind of implied with the example that Rich gave, but our requirement for calories decreases as we age as well. So we know that the amount of calories it takes for us to just keep our hearts beating and our lungs inflating and blood pumping, all of that goes down as we get older, partly because we're usually carrying around a little bit of less lean body mass, like muscle tissue, as we get older. There's a natural progression where many people lose muscle mass. And the other thing is that we're burning less calories. And it starts off so small and so insignificantly, a lot of people don't realize it. So they might say you need 10 calories less per year. Well, who's going to notice 10 calories on your plate, right? But as you start saying, so over a decade though, that means that you now need 100 calories less per day than you did 10 years ago. Still sounds pretty minor, but now think about that comparison from a 20-year-old to a 70-year-old, that's 5 decades. So then you need 500 calories less than you did when you were 20. So just to kind of put that into comparison, and that would be, unless you are like, continuing an incredible amount of physical activity, which many older folks aren't. Mm-hmm. So we do know that their caloric requirements do decrease. And as far as other vitamins too, like Rich mentioned, the iron, the B12, we also know that your needs for calcium and vitamin D, they both increase. And those are some cutoffs around 50, and as far as others, it's around 70, but we definitely need more calcium and vitamin D as we age. Just simple things like when you're out in the sunlight, we have your skin takes sunlight and converts that to a precursor to vitamin D, but as we age, our skin becomes less capable of doing that. So your requirements actually go up for vitamin D and calcium.
What does deficiency in vitamin B12 do? I'm interested in the B12 that you refer to.
We know that has a lot of different effects. One of the common symptoms is people start noticing like tingling in their fingertips, but at that point, that's a symptom that you have really caused some permanent damage, so that peripheral neuropathy, where you're just not getting the good sensation in your fingertips. Also, there's more confusion and things like that. So it is affecting your central nervous system if you're not getting enough vitamin B12.
And another piece of that is the blood cells are affected by that. And so you can end up with a type of anemia called pernicious anemia, and that is characterized by what Donna's talking about. So lack of energy is another characteristic of that. And the challenge is that, you show up to the doctor and say, I don't have a lot of energy. Well, great, welcome to the club, right? Like, that doesn't help. Okay, I have headaches, so that doesn't, right? So it's a fairly descript set of symptoms that come with
You use the word tolerate carbohydrates. What does tolerate mean?
it. Sure. I think we only have an hour, so I have to. Yeah, no, that's one. It's one I'm happy to answer. Let's see. So, let's pretend you haven't eaten anything yet today at all whatsoever, and you're fasted. You have a very, very, like a teaspoon of sugar in your entire blood volume. That's it. Everything else is either stored or it's converted into fat. We can store, even our real big, a couple of big football players, right? They have like a pound of carbohydrates stored in their entire body. We don't store it well. So circulating in our blood is the amount in a very, very small amount of juice, a couple of sips of juice. That's what's in our entire circulation. So when we consume carbohydrate, we have to get that out of the blood. Acutely, it can be very dangerous. It's very rare, but it can be dangerous, especially in type 1 diabetes for people who don't make insulin. So acutely, it can be dangerous, but chronically, it definitely is. And the deal is, how well can you handle the carbohydrate you eat? How well are you able to take that and, number one, disperse it into tissue, and number two, are you taking it and converting it to fat that can become dangerous to your health? So that's what tolerance means in that way. How well can you convert the carbs? Somebody with later stage type 2, you can hook me if you need to, John. Somebody with type 2 diabetes that's become dependent upon insulin, so is well along in the progression of the condition, probably tolerates 30 to 50 grams of carbs per day, and beyond that will derange metabolic health. Versus your 18-year-old cross-country runner that I mentioned before probably can eat 300 grams a day and not display any issues at that time. That's what I mean by tolerance, and I hope that helps a little bit.
In the back.
Yes, I know that in terms of some of the nutrients that we need, and certainly the minerals and so on, that eating good food is really important. But what about the whole issue of multivitamins? Because I know there's been a lot of discussion. Some physicians feel, you really should be just eating good food. Others say, well, it's not a bad thing because you can eliminate whatever you don't need. So I just thought I'd ask that question.
As far as my message that I tell the students all the time is that I would like to see you getting your nutrients from food first as much as possible. Okay, so I'm not pushing supplements, but I do recognize, especially in this age group with older adults, that many people are on medications that can actually interfere with your nutritional status, so that your needs for specific nutrients are increased, or your body is simply not absorbing the amount of nutrients that you used to. So we're seeing decreases in the absorption rates of certain nutrients like calcium as we get older. And then if we're on medications that interfere with certain nutrients, I think we do actually need more than the average person. And depending on your appetite and depending on how much you actually eat, it may be helpful to take a multivitamin supplement. But I'm not recommending single doses of just one specific vitamin, like going with a lot of vitamin A or a lot of vitamin E, because that has been proven to be harmful in research studies. So I would say eat real food and get your nutrients as much as possible from the food, and then a supplement that maybe gives you no more than 100% of the RDA would not be harmful, because your intake from the food and the vitamins is still under what we're calling the UL, the upper limit. The government has set sort of limits above which we think your intake could become toxic. So I don't want to see people in that range.
Thank you.
Please.
Would that go for like water-soluble and fat-soluble nutrients, or are you speaking directly towards like more fat-soluble nutrients in that case?
Well, the fat-soluble nutrients are stored by the body, so those would become toxic more easily. But we have seen adverse effects from even having too much, so we do have ULs for the water-soluble nutrients as well. So your B vitamins, vitamin C, Those do have ULs set for many of them, and so we typically say if you have an excess, you would basically pee that out. You'll have expensive urine, but there are some that are causing some negative effects, so I wouldn't say don't worry about the water soluble.
What about vitamin D3? Is there a point where you can be taking too much D3?
Yep, you still could be taking D3 in excess. There have been research studies looking at giving pretty large doses, and they haven't observed negative effects. Like these are in cultures where usually, like I said, we get some vitamin D by being out in the sunshine. And in cultures like Middle Eastern countries where women are traditionally covered in clothing, their full body is covered and they're not exposed to the sun, they've tried to bring up their vitamin D levels with some very large doses. And those studies haven't shown adverse effects, but there is a UL set for vitamin D as well. So I can't tell you exactly the number right off the top of my head, but I can look that up for you.
Dean Gonstein?
I recently saw a program on public TV about supplements, and one of the things I remember is that most people are taking supplements without knowing what the ingredients really are. And I would be interested in what your perspective is on supplements.
Supplements are an unregulated industry, so we have to be very careful. All right, so like when I said I would recommend something that was 100% and you're not taking a large mega dose of any one particular vitamin, I think that I could have added a little bit more too, so that I think you want to take a look and see where is your supplement manufactured. Typically those, I would feel more comfortable if it's coming from the US as opposed to other countries. You can also look for some labels that show that these are not mandatory, so that there are no government testing agencies that will say, we see accuracy with what's on your label compared to what you actually have in the supplement. But there are some independent testing services, so if you see the letters NSF or USP, those abbreviations on a label will tell you that this product has been tested by an independent agency, and you can have a bit more confidence that you're getting what the label says you're getting. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
No, Tom?
Can you comment on food portion control and how that plays into all this?
Sure, yeah, I can talk a little bit about it. So portion control, I said to Charlie I'd make some disclaimers. One of my disclaimers is I have some bias in some of these areas because I'm a nutrition researcher and because of the work that I do now. But asking people to eat in moderation is generally an unfair thing to do. And this is my personal opinion. It's very difficult to actually do that in practice. And it's because some foods have addictive qualities to them, whether it's the ritual of the consumption of the food, whatever it may be. So portion control is an idea based upon people using their willpower. And when you use portion control to help people and they don't succeed, the automatic belief is, I failed, I'm a failure, I don't have enough willpower, I can't do it. And I don't like that approach, personally. So it makes sense from a very objective and practical standpoint. Eating smaller portions can translate into people weighing less. But to do that in real world is very difficult. So I like to try to use different types of approaches than portion control, but it is the status quo, people use it a lot. I don't buy it. Sorry, not trying to start a fire over here. Being honest.
President Flynn?
A question. A lot of the research into nutrition has to do with the impact on physical activity or physical performance. Is there a growing body of research being done on the fact that older people aren't perhaps as engaged in that physical activity as intensively anyway, with the impact of nutrition on intellectual performance? I ask that because 50 years ago, I think, I have to say this once a year before I don't forget it, I was involved in the impact of varied intensities of exertion and levels of, let me try that once more. The impact of varied intensities of exertion and levels of aerobic capacity on the performance of intellectual tasks. And because fighter pilots, astronauts, whatever, you split decisions, they got to react quickly and whatever. A lot of that has to do with their physical ability, but somewhere along the line, that's feeding the brain and whatever. So I didn't know if there's direct research there, or is it all the better you are from a physical activity standpoint, the better you're going to function from a mental standpoint.
I think nutrition is kind of interesting because we've kind of broken the field of nutrition down. So first we talk about, well, we're going to eat well to prevent cardiovascular disease or this or that. But when you think about it, the nutrients are flowing through your whole body, right? Not just your heart or your liver or whatever. So what's good for your heart, typically we're learning, is also good for your brain. So that keeping your blood sugars under good control is obviously good in helping to prevent type 2 diabetes, that type of thing. But we also know that that's been shown to be beneficial for your brain. So we're finding, there's people interested in, well, what can I eat to potentially minimize my risk for developing Alzheimer's disease or other things. I'm not sure if that's where your question is going, but we're kind of finding that diets that are helpful for your heart typically help your brain as well. So the Mediterranean diet, for example, where this was a diet that they noticed people living on the island of Crete, off the shore of Greece many years ago, were very healthy and looked at, well, how do they eat and what is this diet like? And so we found that, they're eating a good amount of seafood as you would if you were in the middle of the Mediterranean, but they're also using a lot of olive oil. They have a lot of fruits and vegetables in their diet. And we're finding studies showing that a diet like this, where we're eating a lot of whole foods, very little processed foods, and they're emphasizing the seafood and the olive oil, legumes are a big part of that diet, that we're seeing that type of a diet is associated with. So we can't say cause and effect because it's hard to put people on a diet and randomly assign them to follow this for 40 years. That's not going to happen. But we are seeing that diets like that basically are associated with a lower risk of cognitive impairment or early dementia and things like that.
There's, can I throw two?
Yeah.
Two sentences. It's not happening. So along the mental clarity, I think it's an area where we need a ton more research. It's not understood. And I remember a speaker that you brought in on this, an exercise, and I can't remember his name, but it was fabulous.
Harley Reynolds, I think, the Carpenter lecture.
No, this was, we were over in the chapel.
Marsh,
Yeah, in Marsh, and I forget his name, but he was
Dr.
a,
PNC?
could be, I mean, he was tremendous.
The Alzheimer's.
Physical activity, brain
The
health.
brain, the
Yeah.
guy, yeah.
Yeah, so anyways, but,
Guy from Harvard.
yes, he's from Harvard, but he was tremendous, by the way, so if we can come up with his name and people want to, that was, I'll always remember that lecture.
Spark was the name of the book.
But in nutrition, we have a long way to go with that, but one area that I'll say is pretty interesting, there's a guy named Dom D'Agostino, and Dom is doing work with the military, and he uses a very, very unique nutritional approach called ketosis. And people talk about a ketogenic diet. So this is very, very, very low carbohydrates. And he's using that to protect Navy SEALs who are at depth, so hyperbaric conditions, and the toxicities that can happen. And this type of nutritional approach is helping those warriors to function in ways that we didn't think they could. And that has spawned areas of research along what you're talking about, which is this understanding of mental clarity. And since the brain doesn't really have a good barrier for glucose, it actually makes a ton of sense. From a theoretical standpoint, a long way to go to really full measure.
Talk about the research on how much water we should drink and how healthy it is to drink some today.
So, could you say the last part?
Water, just, I'm interested in the amount of water we should drink each day.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So I think a general guideline for that is that we pretty much, they say you need 1 cc of water for every calorie. So if you're eating, let's say 2,000 calories, that means you would need 2 liters or 8 cups of water. If your caloric requirements are only 1,500 calories, then you're closer to needing about 6 cups of water per day. And that's not including, that's for like the average person. So if you're out exercising strenuously in the heat, you're going to be needing a lot more to replace those losses. But a general amount recommendation is that. And it's kind of interesting because older adults don't perceive their need to drink as much as younger folks do. So that sensation of thirst or being thirsty is blunted. And so a lot of older adults can slip into dehydration without realizing it. So they could be just not drinking enough because their body isn't telling them, I'm thirsty.
President Flynn's question prompted me to think about all the TV commercials that we see, and thinking of brain health. I'm thinking of the one commercial that that thing is supposed to be derived from jellyfish. Is that really legitimate? Has that been tested, researched?
So I don't know about the research on that particular item. I've heard of it, I don't know anything about it, I just don't know enough to say. Yeah, I think I want to hear it, yeah. What I will say is, things that sound flashy, so if you've ever been in one of my exercise science classes, and I can't get in trouble now, hopefully. Yeah, Charlie was asking about these changing grade folks. One of the things I said is, if you're a new personal trainer somewhere and you want to get attention, go in there and safely do something off the wall with your client. Safely do something no one's ever seen. Everyone in the gym is going to look at it and they're going to assume what you're doing is better than what everybody else is doing because they don't know what it is. And then you'll get some clients and then you can stop doing off the wall. So, but Dr. Considine, I think that those things come up all the time. To rigorously test them takes a huge amount of time, and the companies that make them are not willing to rigorously test them because it takes too long. So they have to rely on usually theory and really good marketing. I'm not taking anything away from them, but I would be extremely cautious about anything until you vet it carefully.
I agree.
Go ahead, then.
I was going to say, I agree, and I think, again, it sounds like a supplement, which is an unregulated industry, so it's kind of buyer beware.
I would bet somebody had this question. There's so much information out there, with the internet and the media and the things we were just talking about. How do I sort through it and decide what is healthy for me, or what is best for me, or what is not best for me? That's kind of more of a public policy question than
I think it was a physicist, Richard Feynman, who said, when I graduated my bachelor's in physics, I thought I knew everything except a couple things. And then when I finished I think it was his master's or doctorate in physics, and I thought I knew almost nothing except a couple of things.
Yeah.
And his final statement was, I know how to make it work for me. And I love that, and that's basically the approach that I tell people they have to take. That's such a hard question to answer, but basically, most of the information you see is extremely biased in one way or another, whether it's based on, most nutrition research is junk. And Dr. Ioannidis, if you've heard of him, I know Bob and I have talked about this paper before, but it was life-changing for me, understanding how junky most of the research is. So now you're basing your needs on junk science and consensus statements that were made from junk science. So it's pretty difficult, and my advice to people always about nutrition, I have a couple of different little things I always say. Number one is think in patterns, and number two is the one I want to talk about, which is know yourself. All I'd encourage you to do is keep a little journal and say, I felt great today, what did I do? I felt terrible today, what happened? That journal will tell you more about your nutrition needs than probably anything else you'll find.
That was, by the way, Rich, was Dr. John Rady from Harvard.
Could you repeat that, please?
Dr. John Rady, R-A-T-E-Y.
Rady, yes.
From Harvard, he wrote a book, it's called Spark.
Oh, yeah.
And it had to do with exercise and learning, the impact of exercise on learning.
Oh, it was very influential, I remember that.
Yeah, it's still a good book. That was 2008 when he did that. But
And what was fascinating, I had read that, was that he was connecting that with public school students,
Right.
elementary, secondary, who were taking out recess, were taking away physical education.
Exactly.
And then indirectly affecting potentially,
Right.
the cognitive abilities of the
Right.
kids. He's still
It's still good research.
Yeah.
And I had another suggestion, because it is really hard to grasp about making sense of what you're hearing, because there's so much misinformation out there. And I was thinking about that because I thought, what can we recommend if you're looking for something reputable? And there are 2 nutrition newsletters that I've taken a look at that typically, they may have some stories where they might have a slant that I might disagree to some extent, but a lot of what they're saying I think is evidence-based. And so one is Nutrition Action, which is from the Center for Science and the Public Interest. And so that's a cost, but it's something less than $25 a year for a subscription. Also, the Harvard School of Medicine has a nutrition newsletter called, I believe, the Nutrition Source. And that, again, is pretty much evidence-based. So you've got people who are research scientists thinking and critiquing and writing about this. So you can get some pretty reputable information there as opposed to believing everything you see on the internet.
Maybe just one final question as we're talking about the changes in dietary needs. And you can both speak to this, or one of you. What would be the differences in the recommended percentages of the macronutrients, fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, for example, for a 30-year-old or somebody who is a 70-year-old? Are there changes, are there differences in the general percentages?
I think that's a hard question to answer. I think Rich alluded to that, saying that people tend to tolerate carbohydrates less well as we age. But I think I kind of hesitate from giving out a certain percent that we should follow, because I think everybody's body is different. We're all handling carbohydrates versus fat in different ways. So I don't like to just put out a number like that, a certain percent. And also I think that people don't go home and calculate what they ate. So people don't translate that to, I'm eating 35% of this and that, because it becomes so regimented. And you do want eating to be enjoyable and not just this sort of miserable thing where you have to meet a certain percent of your calories each day. That would be a lot of homework on your part to log it. My students do that for 3 days in Intro to Nutrition at the beginning of the semester and then again at the end. But, we have software that can do that for you to figure it out, but the average person, I don't think, really, would take that as a practical suggestion for them. So I don't push it that way.
One thing that I've heard in the past is to eat the carbs you earn. If you're having a really sedentary day at home and you haven't really had a lot of physical activity, that's probably the day that you would want to tone down the carbohydrate intake. On the other hand, if you're having a very active day, that might be the time where you might need to add a few carbohydrates.
Very practical suggestion.
Yeah, I think the number is it's a range, as Bob has alluded to. I know personally mine's around 120, and the range is probably 100 to 140. And this is all from just tinkering, by the way. I know if I go above 140, I'm gonna gain weight, my metabolism is gonna go south. Yeah, I just know that. And you're absolutely right. Now, if you're sick, you're taking corticosteroids, you had a poor night's sleep, it's at the bottom of the range. If you're super active, you're sleeping great, you're stress-free, low stress, you're probably at the top of the range.
Are there reasonable computer programs for diet analysis and tracking your intake?
We used to have the government had a free software called Super Tracker, which has been taken down, sadly. So I've actually been looking for free software for my students to be able to use in class. So we do have two that they have been using. One is called the ASA 24, which is put out by the American Cancer Society. And it's more used for research studies, but it does actually walk you through a series of prompts. So if you say that I had eggs and toast for breakfast, then it's going to say, tell me how your eggs were prepared, what kind of bread did you have, what did you put on your bread. So it walks you through that completely, and you can enter a day and see your results, and that's free. So anybody can use that, and it's pretty user-friendly. Another one is put out by the Dietitians of Canada, and that is, I believe that's called eatracker.com. So it's sort of like eat, but eatracker.com from the Dietitians of Canada. And that has more of like you type in the food that you want, and then it generates a list, and you scroll down the list to say, I had eggs, oh, they were scrambled eggs. And then you kind of move on through that. But that too will give you free breakdown of your diet, and you can see exactly how many grams of carbohydrates you're eating, everything else. So it is useful if people want to take a more detailed look at their diets.
Thank you.
I wonder if either of you have read Stephen Gundry's book, The Plant Paradox, and if you're familiar with that, the lectin-free diet, what you think of that?
I'm sorry, I haven't, I don't know.
Cardiothoracic surgeon and Linda
Have you read it?
I have.
Could you share maybe
Sure,
what
yeah.
the themes were?
He basically says that we should all be eating a lectin-free diet. It's a sticky protein that attaches to a sugar molecule, and it solves the leaky gut syndrome, and it can lead to so many cardiovascular problems, and on and on. He's written a ton of books. I work in a bookstore and it was a bestseller.
Homework, everybody has to
Yeah,
read
there
the
you go.
book.
I'm sorry,
familiar.
I'm sorry, I don't have any
Okay.
comments for you on that.
It made a lot of sense. The science made a lot of sense to me.
But yes, I was just going to say, oftentimes people say the most important meal of the day is breakfast. Is that really true?
I think there are definite benefits to eating breakfast, especially for an older adult population. If you think about, we need protein in our diets, and as we fast, we're basically not getting protein through the night, right? So you've maybe gone 8 hours at least since your dinner meal, probably more like 12 or 13 or 14. And so your body is going to have to start, like, it still needs protein, so you haven't eaten. And if you wait until lunch now to try and feed your body some protein, it's going to have to do a little bit more work and can start breaking down some of your own muscle tissue for the proteins that you need to recreate. So I think it's useful for older adults to sort of keep themselves, you know, we said part of what you're doing as aging is that we're losing muscle mass. So if we want to try and sort of minimize that loss of muscle mass, I would say try to get a third of your protein requirement met early in the day, then at lunch, then at dinner, so that you're spacing that out throughout the day would be helpful, because you spend more time in a state where you're feeding yourself, and that's a trigger by having protein getting broken down in your blood. That is a trigger for your body to actually create protein. So if we go for long periods of time without eating, then we're, you know, just putting yourselves into that state where you are more prone to break down.
And also, what about being consistent? They say also as you get older that you should eat, if you have breakfast at 8 o'clock, you should do that every day. I mean, like the body really kind of expects food at certain hours, but if you get into a habit of doing that, is that really true? Or, you know, being consistent about timing?
I don't think it has to be that exact, you know, that we're really so regimented. If you sleep in, I think you're fine.
Right.
But, you know, I do recommend that people try to get some good nutrition in earlier in the day. I also think circadian rhythm-wise, we're better programmed to metabolize our food if we're eating earlier in the day.
And it's challenging too, just as we age, you know, there's more dependency on medications a lot of times, which require intake of food. So it's hard for a blanket recommendation, but I would say doing that little study of yourself and when you feel well and when you don't would probably help out a lot.
A lot of that's habit, isn't it? Because we all, whatever habit we may have, it can maybe appear more than anywhere else. If you have a dog and you feed the dog every day at X hour, the dog is by the bowl at X hour. He needs that food at that X hour, but he needs it psychologically at that hour. So psychic might be involved a little bit.
And I agree. And so there's part of, like, when things are the status quo, if you want to call it homeostasis in life, right? If we figure out how to deal with that, that's awesome. That's like a huge step that most people probably don't generally get to. But if you got that, the next problem is, like, what happens, you know, as they say, everybody's got a plan till they get punched in the face, right? Like, a little aggressive there, but you know what I'm saying? This is what happens when something goes wrong. Your travel plans change, you get sick, you have a death in the family, I mean, I can go on, and the patients that we work with at Bird, I see it every single day. How do you handle that? Because then you got to get yourself from that back to homeostasis, and that's where most people really have trouble. So, and I think if nutrition has a future, it is in the personalization of that type of thing.
I guess it would not be a discussion of nutrition, and when we talked about potential questions, if we don't say a few words at least about obesity. I know Rich had some thoughts on being controversial, sometimes difficult to explain concept, and I toss that up to our panelists.
This is great, Charlie. Did you decide I'm going to open 10 cans? I like that. I love it. Do you want me to do this one? So it's a really important topic because it's having an impact on society. And in and of itself, I don't think obesity is a problem. It's the comorbidities that come with it that are a very, very, very substantial problem, and are probably going to bankrupt our healthcare system pretty soon if we don't fix it. So it is actually a huge problem because of that. And I think that the science about it, people are still kind of up in arms. There's all kinds of controversy about this, because the original way of thinking is, well, it's very simple. If you take in more calories than you expend, you gain weight. And this is, so Gary Taubes talks about this a lot, so I'm going to use his words. These aren't my original thoughts, and they're brilliant, so that's how you know they're not mine. So, but Gary's point of that is sure, that may be true, but why? What it would cause? That's not a cause, that's explaining a situation. Okay? So what causes you to take in more than you expend? And that's really what we need to get to the root of. So going back to the question on willpower, you would look at it from, if you're using this angle, is we'll just get the smaller coffee or whatever, make this smaller, and that's all you gotta do. Move more and eat less. That's the traditional way to handle it. It's not working. Like, it doesn't work, sorry. That's pretty controversial maybe, but it does not work. I think we're really gotta stop going after it that way, because it's putting too much blame on the individual. Well, you don't move a lot, you don't move enough, of course you're gaining weight, you don't eat right, of course you're overweight, it's your fault. Versus looking at it and say, why do people tend to overeat? What is causing people to eat large portions than they should, or whatever it may be? That's the real cause, and what people would say biologically is happening is we're trapping fat inside of the cell. Okay? And if you trap the fat and you either shove more in or you stop it from getting out, you're over-accumulating fat, which leads to obesity. Sure, you ate more calories than you expended, but why did they get stored as fat, and why did you do it, is really the thing we need to figure out.
I think the other point too is that we are, like you said, obesity is the issue, but we're also recognizing that kind of even where you're storing your fat matters. Would you agree with that?
For the most part, yeah.
So that we have some people who may be thin too, but they're putting on a lot of fat, what we'll call visceral fat, deep in your abdomen, and that seems to be more dangerous than the fat that's, pinch an inch under your skin, that subcutaneous fat. So I think some people might be overweight or obese, but more metabolically healthy sometimes, depending on where that fat is being stored.
Yeah, there's a phenotype called sarcopenic obese, and if you talk to endocrinologists, they'll say these are some of the most difficult patients to treat, because there is no outward sign that things are not going well, essentially. And sarcopenic, well, we're at Springfield College, you probably already knew that, but this is a loss of muscle mass. In obese, we know is an overaccumulation of adipose tissue. So in combination, the sarcopenic obese phenotype is not a very large body size as much as is a very small muscle mass with more adipose tissue ratio-wise. And metabolically, that's one of the things Don was talking about. That's a real challenging one for people to deal with.
Another term that pops up regularly in the media commercials, probiotics.
Yes.
Could someone kind of give us an overview, or both of you comment on probiotics?
How about if I do a little and you do that?
Sure.
Donna's got the practical stuff. I just like sitting here and sitting around the campfire and talking. So, let's see. I think it's, please don't quote me on this, but I think we have like 300 trillion bacteria on us all right now. It's an insane number of bacteria. They're all over us. And I'm not trying to gross you out. They're on everything. And the health, so there's this really neat TED Talk on it, but basically it has to do with, are we really human? So the majority of genetic material on us is bacteria, it's not human. So if that is true, which I don't think anybody even disputes that it's true, it's a matter of like, what's the health of our ecosystem, which is the human being with the bacteria around it. So the bacteria are everywhere, but there's a really concentrated amount in our gut, so in the intestines in particular, and that's called the microflora. And the microflora have a lot to do like with how we digest and absorb nutrients. And what is known at this time, as far as I know, please correct me if I'm behind the times here, is that a deranged microbiome is connected with many chronic diseases. So we know that. We also, that's one. And number two, we know that you can change your microbiome based on your eating patterns. It actually can change. Those are known. what's not necessarily known is like, what's like the perfect profile? It's probably kind of different for people, but we know what bad ones look like. So from here, it's figuring out how do you take all that information and combine it with eating the right set of nutrients to optimize that. And that transitions probably in my time to Donna, which is how can we promote the healthiest gut bacteria profile, and we think a lot of that has to do with prebiotics and probiotics.
Great, so the probiotics, like Rich said, are really, we're talking about live bacterial cultures in our food. So if you're eating things like, let's say, yogurt, like Chobani, Stonefield Farms, Activia, they all have live bacterial cultures. So those are typically seen as healthy foods that you could be adding to your diet to promote the growth of the good, healthy bacteria to live inside your large intestine, where a lot of them are hanging out. So we're promoting that, but also to support and keep them healthy, they need food to digest. And what do they digest? They digest and work on the fiber. So we personally, as human beings, don't have enzymes to break down fiber, but these bacteria will break it down. So you can also have prebiotics added to your diets, which are basically food for the bacteria. So whether we're eating a lot of vegetables, high fiber things have fiber in them, and that's a great source of fuel for the bacteria to burn and metabolize. We can also see even foods that have sometimes gotten a bad reputation, like potatoes or whatever. We have Dr. Headley in our department. He's doing a study with resistant starch. So it's a starch that actually resists digestion through our stomachs and our intestines, but once it arrives in our large intestine, bacteria work on it. So he's working with a group of patients who have chronic kidney disease, and we're actually running a randomized trial right now, so we can see half of them are getting a placebo, half of them are getting resistant starch, and we're looking to see, can we change the bacteria inside their gut, because these bacteria are actually doing some really good things for us. So as they break down the fiber, they're breaking it down into some short-chain fatty acids that actually are anti-inflammatory. So we know that chronic kidney disease is characterized by a lot of inflammation. And the diet we typically put these people on is pretty low in a lot of the fruits and vegetables that would be helpful to maintain a healthy gut flora there. So we're trying to see if we give them this supplement, can we help them improve their kidney function and reduce their level of inflammation in their bodies. So we're kind of tying these things in right now.
So the statement of the probiotics aids digestion, I think that was the question of the sorts. Are there some out there that do it better than others? Because a lot of them are on the shelf, and it seems like a lot of we have a daughter who swears by probiotics, and she keeps sending me samples. But it's that perhaps the people in the know, not that we older adults aren't in the know, but it's like if something goes wrong with the computer, just pray that one of your grandchildren are around to fix it. And maybe it's our grandchildren need to fix their diets too, I don't know. But with the probiotics, are good, bad? I mean, the ones off the pills off the shelf?
I don't recommend a particular brand. I think some people, they all have their own unique blend, but we're all walking around with our own unique blend of bacteria. So taking what's on the shelf and then trying to make that become your blend, like sometimes people would recommend this if you've had a bad bout of diarrhea or something like that, or you've been on antibiotics and you've kind of destroyed part of your population of these cells. I just read something recently, and I don't remember in total detail, but they almost said that people were better just eating their normal diet and restoring their own flora than taking something off the shelf. So you have to remember, whatever's in the formulation on the shelf, like there's bacteria that they find in the colon of infants, and they put that into a bottle and they market that, but we're not infants. So I don't know that I recommend a specific one. It may have a helpful short-term benefit, and I would say, as much as possible, I'd probably try not to rely on that, but if you needed to, you really felt like things were going, I'm not a strong advocate, I guess I could put it that way.
If one person has this tremendous response to it, that particular supplement probably had a replacement of something they were low in or really needed, and then another person takes it and is like, I didn't notice anything. It probably wasn't so. And one other comment I'll make too is, I think, I have no data to back this up, by the way. I think it's probably important if you take high-dose antibiotics for a long time, let's say you have pneumonia, you've got put on this really high dose of antibiotics for a long time, you're probably getting, like, wiping out that colony. So at that point, rebuilding that is pretty important. And so I would, if you're ever in that situation, I would work with your provider to figure out how to rebuild that colony.
I recently saw a documentary, Forks Over Knives. Have you ever seen that?
I've seen
I'm wondering about, that advocates plant-based eating and et cetera, but the research that was cited in that documentary really was very persuasive. Can you speak to the plant-based, there seems to be a push about it lately, about no burgers, you need the Impossible Burger or the Beyond Burger, or how valuable is that?
Honor you, that's fine.
Get started on.
Yeah, I definitely have a lot of comments. Especially given the recent papers by Dr. Grayad, who talked about the associations and the data about meat consumption are being blown out of proportion and probably isn't going to affect your health much if you do eat meat. This recently came out. I'm not saying this to start trouble, but that you're exactly right. You're hearing more about it because the group of people who pushes that sort of approach are very vocally against the work of Dr. Grayad and the many popular press articles that were spawned from that. And I think it's a great way of living, actually. Vegan is a tremendous way for a lot of people to live. The question is, who is it right for? And that's what gets a little harder to answer. And it's a very emotionally attached thing. So, I mean, I've talked about this in class. I think a couple of you guys have heard me talk about it. But people become vegetarian and vegan for many reasons. There are religious reasons, there are animal rights reasons, and health is one of them. So you've got to think about which of these reasons that you're taking that approach for. And you know, if it's religious and so on. Whether or not that's the healthiest pattern of eating is very much debatable. I think there are people who eat that pattern who are incredibly healthy, and there are people who would be better off not using that pattern. The video is exciting. And by the way, I have a legion of vegans who hate me, and I don't understand it because I don't hate them. I made a TED Ed video, you might have seen it, but and then basically got personally attacked by a large group of vegans, and I don't understand it. But so if you want to Google my TED, it's TED Ed Richwood, and you'll see it. It's about carbohydrates, and then you can see the other one if you want. But I'm just saying, I have no issues with that at all. I think it's great for a lot of people, but people need help figuring out if that's the right approach for them.
And I think, I definitely, if we're talking Mediterranean diet, that has limited amounts of meats in it, that has seafood in it. So I'm not necessarily, I think that I mentioned as a healthy way of eating. So I think if you have more fruits and more vegetables in your diet, as a plant-based diet would, and more legumes in it, you're getting a lot of the nutrients that we think are very healthy for you, but the challenge is making sure you are getting, let's say, enough protein, which takes some work. What are we going to do about the vitamin B12, which we want to make sure you're getting enough of? Okay, so people need to look at that. I mean, we do have some sustainability issues too, so that if people even cut back partially on some meat consumption and increase more vegetable consumption, that we, just think about the health of the planet. Our developing countries are becoming wealthier and starting to realize that they enjoy meat as well. And so when we look at the CO2 production from all the beef and cattle, that types of things, it has an impact on our planet as well. So I think moving in the direction where we're starting to see people eat some more plant-based foods would be healthy for a lot of people. But it, again, depends on what we're eating, how we're replacing it, and making sure we're getting all the nutrients we need.
If you replace a dozen donuts with a dozen Brussels sprouts, you're better. That's an easy one.
Yep.
But they're not all that easy.
No, I really like the point of view that the vegetarian or vegan diet can be really helpful for people. It can be very healthy if people do it the right way. Honestly, people do it for a lot of different reasons. Do you guys know any good sources for, because I know it can be very healthy, but it's also really easy to do a vegetarian or vegan diet wrong. So, me personally, I've read a lot about nutrition, taken many classes on nutrition, but I have friends or family members that they're going to go vegan or they go vegetarian. And I tell them, you know, you should try to get enough protein, but I don't have the good recommendations of how they should go about that, or even where they should look so they can get this information on their own. Because I think they can be healthy. I don't want to tell them not to do it, but I worry about them doing it on their own, and especially if they're getting older, not consuming enough protein, lots of the negative effects of that.
It's not a hobby. That's what I say to people, absolutely, it is not a hobby. You need to really think through it and do it right. Do you have good sources, Donna?
You know, I can't say I can recommend a specific text or organization. I think you could take a look, the myplate.gov does have a vegetarian eating pattern on it. So like you can say, put in your age, your height, your weight, all this information. It does a sort of generic calculation of what it estimates your caloric and your protein requirements are, your nutrient requirements, and then it does have a pattern. So if you are vegetarian, like it could basically put a pattern together so people can use that at least as a starting point to see where they are.
I think we've used up our time, sadly. There are other events folks may be planning to go to. So I thought to wrap this up and bring some closure, I'd ask our panelists maybe to recommend some specific ideas, behaviors, suggestions for pattern for healthy eating as we age.
Sure. One of the things that one of these days I do want to do is write a book, and I'll tell you what it's called. The name of the book is called Understand in really big letters. If you're a publisher, please come see me. I don't have a big social media presence. It's not my thing, and I've talked to publishers who say, your idea is awesome, but you're not on social media, so you can't sell it. So it's called Understand, and then in very small letters, why you're confused about, and then big letters, nutrition. So Understand Nutrition. And it's based on a lot of the things I talked about in the applied nutrition class. So here are my three for you. Number one, be prepared. I am an Eagle Scout, I stole that. But there's real reason for nutrition. Be prepared for nutrition, know yourself, and think in patterns. Those are the three things I recommend to people. Then you've got to drill down into those a little bit. So be prepared means, remember I talked about before when everybody's got a plan until they get pumped, right? So having food available to, in my truck right now, I have a Quest bar that I've got, I'm fine, I'll be fine for hours, which is that. So being prepared means you don't put yourself in a bad position to get derailed. Knowing yourself means know what works for you, and probably more importantly, know what doesn't work for you. If you brought me a plate of brownies and put it in front of me, I wouldn't eat it, and I don't have any special willpower. It's because I know if I eat one, I will fight every one of you until I get every other plate for myself. I cannot stop myself when I eat cookies and brownies, so I'm better off just not eating. That's me knowing myself and you knowing yourself. And third is think in patterns. If I do get derailed and I do have a few slices of pizza, instead of beating myself up, I need to sit back and think about the pattern. What has my pattern been like this week? You know what I've done really well? That was a little snafu. We're going to get back on the pattern. So those are my three recommendations.
All right. And as far as translating that, I mean, I mentioned the Mediterranean diet, which I think is really high in things like fruits and vegetables, and I think we're seeing a lot of good reasons to be eating fruits and vegetables. So as I just kind of encourage you, sometimes people say, oh, I'm just cooking for one, or we're just the two of us, and we're just not eating. I see a lot of my mom's friends not preparing meals, and so whether you're going to cook for yourself, you're going to go grab something somewhere, but try to make it healthy. Find a fruit or vegetable, add this into your days, because we're finding so many beneficial nutrients and things that we're still even discovering in fruits and vegetables. Just trying to incorporate them in a variety of ways. I think that's generally healthy for you. You're going to be minimizing your intake of other junk foods if you're adding some of that, or some salads. And I think those things have been shown to be good for your heart health, good for your brain health, and I think that's really important. Other just general advice is like pay attention when you do have a physical. What's your blood pressure doing? What's your blood sugars doing? Because again, like Rich mentioned, as we get older, we're not so good at tolerating those excess carbohydrates and simple sugars and brownies in our diet. So kind of trying to rein that in somewhat. Don't put yourself in a situation like Rich said. So if you're not, if you know you can't control yourself with brownies, or for me, potato chips, just don't buy them. Just don't put yourself in that situation. But I think keeping those, and even as far as brain health, one of the biggest things that has been recommended so far is keeping your blood pressure, which is good for your heart health, but also for your brain health. So keeping that in good control as much as you can. And again, eating fruits and veggies, people say, oh, I'm watching my salt intake. But we also know that fruits and veggies are high in things like, also dairy products, high in calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, that are also very good for maintaining blood pressure. So lots of reasons to eat fruits and veggies.
Thank you. Well, thank everybody for coming. I'm hopeful that you're leaving with some affirmation of things that you've been doing well. I think we've been preaching to the choir here this year. And there's some usable things that you could take with you from today. Be very interested in your feedback. With this type of discussion worked perfectly, couldn't be any happier. Future topics, if we were to talk, staying within that generic definition of wellness that we talked about. And particularly want to thank Donna and Rich for taking the time on an off day for them to come to campus. They're willing to stay for a few more minutes individually and find a corner and ask some questions that we didn't have time to. So enjoy your weekend at the college. Great to see you, and come back often.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you very much.
Excellent session.